I am excited to reintroduce to you all Brad Udall from the Colorado Water Center.
So, good evening, all commissioners. Michelle, Karen, thanks for putting this all together. So, my topic tonight is Colorado River water supply, climate change, and aridification. And you'll note I don't use drought, although I'll often let it slip in to my vernacular, because what we're undergoing right now is not really drought. Drought is temporary. This is something different. And the term that a lot of scientists have gravitated to is aridification. This image here is actually at Lake Powell, the nation's second largest reservoir. I took it this spring. That's a boat ramp there in the distance that's completely out of commission because the reservoir got to about 25% full. It rebounded somewhat this year, and I'll show you how much it rebounded. That boat ramp's actually back in operation. So, John thankfully showed an image like this earlier, right? Colorado River scaled to size. And the Colorado River's enormous. It's about 80% of the surface water in Colorado. It's far bigger than all other rivers. And frankly, on the Front Range, if we had to live on the South Platte and the Arkansas, we'd have a very different water system because half of the water that we use on the Front Range comes out of the Colorado River system. And there are, John mentioned the 44 transbasin diversions. This image shows many of them. Most of them are actually pretty tiny, these transbasin diversions, but a couple of them are not. Colorado Big Thompson and Denver Water have two huge ones, as does Aurora and Colorado Springs. And again, without those diversions on the Front Range using Colorado River water, it would be completely different here. So, this is an image of the basin, and all those big red arrows represent major diversions out of or upstream in the basin. And there are 7 different states in this basin, 2 nations and 30 tribes. The annual flow going back to 1906, about 14 and 7.75 million acre feet. It's about the size of the Hudson River. It's actually not a very big river. Some call it the hardest working river. The worst drought in the gauged record started in the year 2000, and that drought, the annual total is about 12.5 million acre feet. That's about a 20% decline relative to the flow in the 20th century. And importantly, multiple scientific papers now have put up to half of that decline on human-caused climate change. Why? Because of increased evaporation and potentially also because of reductions in precipitation. That precipitation question is far harder to answer with short-term periods of record. 40 million people depend on this system. Every major city in the American Southwest. So Las Vegas, 90% dependent. Phoenix, 50%. I grew up in Tucson. Arguably, Tucson is 100% dependent because there's no surface water supply in Tucson. Again, the Front Range of Colorado, about half dependent. Albuquerque and Santa Fe actually get water out of the Colorado River despite being in the Rio Grande. Cheyenne, believe it or not, through a complicated mechanism, effectively gets Colorado River water. It's just hard to overstate how important it is to every major city in the American Southwest. There's 4.5 million irrigated acres, and some of the really important agriculture in the U.S. is right on the U.S.-Mexico border in Yuma and in a place called the Imperial Irrigation District in California. And those places have 365-day growing seasons. They grow much of your winter produce. It was fully allocated way back in 1922, and there's this big, broad body of laws and treaties and Supreme Court decisions that we call the Law of the River that encompasses every legal agreement. And I'll talk about the compact here in just a little bit. Withdrawals equaled supplies in about the year 2000. This year, actually last year in June of 2022, the federal government announced because the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States, Lakes Mead and Powell, were so low that we needed immediate cuts of something like 2 to 4 million acre feet in use between 2023 and 2026 when new rules are going to be negotiated. And so we now have two different environmental impact statement processes underway in the basin. A special EIS and SEIS that's underway that'll just determine the rules for the next 3 years, and then a longer term set of rules that will take place government operation post 2026. This year, finally, in May of 2023, we ended up with an agreement for the next 3 years amongst the 7 states after some amazing posturing and sort of elbowing. And the 2026 rules are underway as well. And the one thing I want to point out on this image is in the middle of it is the dividing line between the upper and lower basins, because back in 1922 it got split into 2 parts, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So the combined volume of Lakes Mead and Powell are shown on this image from 1935 all the way out to March 2024. So the March 2024 are projections. They're the little dots on the far right side there. You'll see the initial fill of Lake Powell, and then it flattens out until about the 1970s. That's when Lake Powell came online, and Powell then takes roughly 20 years to fill. And in January of 2000, these 2 reservoirs were 95% full. Almost 50 million acre feet were in those 2 reservoirs. But by April 2023, they were about 25% full. So we'd lost 70% of the contents of, again, the nation's 2 largest reservoirs. And you can see the 2 red arrows there. And that's a loss of 34 million acre feet, or about 1.5 million acre feet every year right there. Again, I mentioned earlier, these flows are down 20% compared to the 20th century. And our wet 2023, right? Everybody in the room kind of knows we had this great winter and everybody got excited about it. Well, let me show you what it did to the combined volume of both reservoirs. On the right side, you can see measured in percent there. It did that. So for all the hoopla, that gets a big whoop-de-doo-dah, right? That's about a 10% increase. And many reporters have asked me, well, how long would it take to refill this system? Well, the kind of dumb answer is, well, if you had a bunch of years like this back to back, which you never have, it would take 6. But the better answer is to go back and look at how long it took Lake Mead or Lake Powell to fill, starting in the 1970s, that ramp. It took 20 some odd years to fill during that period, in a wetter period with lower demands. So I have been saying for years that climate change is water change. And this is an image from the space shuttle. It's to the Pacific Ocean. This is the water planet, right? 70% of the Earth's surface is water. I love this image because you can see a cumulonimbus cloud there in the sort of left center, representing water vapor, right? And the water cycle is a heat-driven cycle, right? Driven by solar energy. Vast quantities of water evaporate every day from the oceans. Most of that rains back down on the ocean, but a little bit of it makes it over under the surface of the land. And in addition to moving water around, the water cycle actually moves heat, because when you evaporate water, the embedded energy in that water, in that evaporated water, it's still there. And when a water precipitates out, that heat gets released. That's the heat that drives thunderstorms and hurricanes. So the movement of heat around the planet and the movement of water are joined at the hip. And in an era of climate change, this is really important, because as you warm the atmosphere actually holds more moisture. 5% or 5 Fahrenheit warming is about 20% increase. And one way that I try and convey that climate change is water change is we now have a bigger sponge above our head. And that sponge allows the atmosphere to hold more water. And then when it decides to come out, it comes out in buckets, right? It seems like hardly a day goes by where you don't have a picture of some unbelievable flood around the surface of the earth. And those new floods, they're being driven by this warmer world that we now inhabit. So heating up the earth, and unevenly heating it, right? The Arctic's heating about 3 times as fast as elsewhere. It leads to a whole bunch of water cycle changes. More evaporation, more precipitation, more moisture in general. This leads to changes in weather patterns. Often it's said that the wet areas get wetter and dry drier. We now get more intense floods and droughts. And in our snowmelt system here, we also see some other unusual changes, right? We see more rain now and less snow. So winters here, we'll get rain in December. When I grew up, that never happened, rain in December. We get earlier runoff, between 2 and 6 weeks earlier now in the Colorado River Basin. We have higher water temperatures and more intense rain. And that earlier runoff sets us up a little bit for failure later in the year because plants green up sooner, they can use more water sooner, and it leaves less to run off into our rivers and creeks. Hence, one really easy explanation for that 20% decline in flow. So what about the compact and the basics of it? This is the signing in Santa Fe in 1922. Basin divided into an upper and lower basin. Each basin got 7.5 million acre feet of what's called beneficial consumptive use. The lower basin, in particular Arizona, complained, and so the lower basin got an extra 1 million acre feet. The Mexico Treaty, which was anticipated but not in place at the time, the compact said water would first be supplied from surplus, if there were any, and then equally from the lower basin and upper basin. And then finally, this clause, which is so important. Compact Article 3D says the upper basin will not cause the flow to be depleted below 75 million acre feet every 10 running years. This is the compact call provision that Linda talked about earlier, and it's a really important provision. Again, note that language. Upper basin will not cause the flow to be depleted. The tribes were completely excluded from the compact. And I'll note every one of these provisions has an ongoing dispute about how to interpret it. And the law of the river is far broader than just the compact, but the compact's really important. Here's a look at water use from 1960 by basin. So evaporation there is down at the bottom, about 1 million an acre half feet, 10% roughly. Here's the upper basin. Upper basin uses only 4.5 million acre feet out of their 7.5 promised, and it hasn't changed since about 1980. The lower basin use peaked in 2000 at 10.5, far more than their compact allocation, and it's now about 8.5 right there. And then the total basin use with Mexico peaked at 17 and now is about 14.3. Again, note I said the flow since 2000 about 12.5 million acre feet. That's a mismatch, and that can't continue. That's why those reservoirs have plummeted downward. Agriculture uses about 80%. And this is true worldwide, actually, in dry areas. It's not anything special about us. It's just when you grow crops, you use a lot of water. So what about a compact call? Here's the conventional old take. 10 years ago, I would have given you this story. I would have said a compact call is analogous to a river call in a state where a downstream senior calls up the state engineer or his representative and says, hey, I'm not getting my water, go check it out. And the division engineer can go out and actually shut down diverters so that senior gets the water to which their water right under prior appropriation entitles them. A compact call is an imperfect analogy because there's no enforcement mechanism. The federal government can't come and shut us down. There's nobody to do that, but the idea still has taken hold. Again, there's this upper basin obligation. And many attorneys, in the absence of a pre-climate change rule, said this was a hard and fast delivery obligation that the upper basin had to make. 75 million acre feet every 10 running years, or 82.3 if you count the Mexico. So this is what I would have told you. And what's really important is that transbasin diverters, namely the cities in the Front Range, would be enormously impacted by this because they are junior users in Colorado. And I will again say, look back to the language I said. There's not an affirmative obligation in there. It's a will not deplete, right? And for years now, the state engineer, the attorney general, others have studied how a compact call might affect us. So here's the new interpretation. That 3D, it's phrased as a negative obligation, not a positive obligation. Will not cause the flow to be depleted versus will deliver. It was an anti-hoarding, a drought obligation. It's not appropriate for the climate change world. Drought is a temporary flow reduction, not around a long-term mean that doesn't vary. Under climate change, it's a permanent flow reduction around a declining mean. The upper basin would have never agreed to a flow obligation, a fixed delivery obligation under permanent declining flows, and the language says they didn't do that. Equal sharing is embedded in the compact, and the problem right now is the lower basin's gotten dependent on this extra water, a fixed delivery amount. But there's a dawning lower basin awareness that they're going to have to share in this. And we need a new interpretation of what 3D means, but it's not clear exactly what that is. And a simple possibility is until the river flows decline to twice what the upper basin uses, which is to say 9 million acre feet, the upper basin shouldn't have to deliver any water to the lower basin. So we're going to continue to live with this uncertainty for a little bit of time, but I just want to point out that there's this dawning awareness that that delivery obligation is not what it was once thought to be. So aridification, not drought. Listen, it's called climate change for a reason. The climate is continuing to change. I really object to the term new normal here because it's likely these flows continue to decline, possibly as much as 40% by mid-century. Aridification involves declining snowpacks, earlier runoff, shorter winters, more rain, less snow, higher temperatures, drying soils, severe fires, forest mortality. Sorry if I'm depressing you. This warm, thirsty atmosphere that holds more moisture, storm tracks that probably move poleward, in our case northward, and mega drought. So let me summarize. Our demands in the system are out of balance with the supplies. These reservoirs are unsustainably low, flows are down. Reservoirs can't continue to release water to fix this imbalance. Much of the problem's in the lower basin, but we're not scot-free here. We're going to have to do our part to help solve this problem. Any growth in upper basin demands is also problematic. And there are people in the upper basin who'd like to see demands grow, but there's just so much water, right? I mean, mass balance rules here. And any additional upper basin demands mean the lower basin has to curtail not just a little bit, but even more, which is even harder than their big lift right now. And additional upper basin demands put existing upper basin demands at risk. So it's not a free lunch to think that, oh, we're entitled to more water, let's go get it. Potential for additional large climate change flow reductions, another 20% by mid-century. And this upper basin obligation is just not clear. We need a new understanding. There are these two processes underway to figure out what the new rules are in the system. And finally, let me just finish by saying that prior appropriation, the system by which all Western states live under, is a winner-take-all system. And in a modern, interdependent society, it's really problematic. Because oftentimes municipal users are junior users and they can't be shut off completely. You just can't do that. And so much of the issues in the American West around water right now are trying to figure out how to make winner take all less harsh. How do you share supplies under a system that doesn't really promote sharing to begin with?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brad. I think we probably have time for one question. And you're the lucky guy who caught my eye when... Sorry. Oh, that's harsh. I'm sorry.
So I guess in the West, each state has kind of their own individual water law. And my understanding is that Colorado is the strictest in terms of prior appropriation compared to the other states, in that we're most strict. We don't have consideration of other uses, that sort of thing. if there were to be federal involvement, if I guess we weren't able to come up with a 7-state agreement on a Colorado River Compact, how would the differences between those state water laws kind of play out at the federal level?
So in the case of the Colorado, there's an Upper Colorado River Compact that was signed in 1948. And in theory, that describes the relationship amongst the 4 states that sit in the upper basin. The federal government actually has vast powers in the lower basin because of a Supreme Court case in 1964 and because of some federal legislation down there. It's not exactly clear how this plays out, but I think the lesson from this huge court case in 1964 was you can't solve this by litigation. You have got to negotiate these solutions. It's far too complicated for a court system to get this right. And I'm actually optimistic about the ability of these 7 states and Mexico and the federal government all to come to an agreement. Now, listen, you're going to see a lot of sharp elbows out there and a lot of drama, but ultimately at the end of the day, people will come up with a solution to figure out how to deal with these declining flows. I'm not optimistic about a lot of things, but that ultimately I am, and it's good. Actually, just another little uplifting after all my bummer about climate change. Governments allocate resources, right? And you might not think of water allocation and water management as U.S. government, but it truly is. And there's some real bright spots here in the way these states work together. Again, despite all the posturing and stuff in the news, we will get this fixed, I think, and figured out in a way. And one more just comment about Colorado. This state has more good going for it than any other state in the basin. And it's because of that court system. We actually have dedicated attorneys and engineers and a whole system of water professionals that a lot of other states don't have. It's cumbersome at times because of this court system, but it actually gives us information and data that a lot of other states don't have. And we use that to our benefit.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. I appreciate it. And for our final presenter before we open it up for questions, and we'll go to you first when we open up for questions.